My name is Madeline Taylor, and today it is my distinct honor to introduce Wellesley's very own Professor Nina Tumarkin. Professor Tumarkin is the Kathryn Wasserman Davis Professor of Slavic Studies, Professor of History, and Director of Russian Area Studies program here at Wellesley College. She is also a longtime associate of Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Her past career has included the role of advisor to President Reagan, for whom she wrote 2 invited papers and served as one of 6 Soviet experts who advised the president, vice president, and key cabinet members shortly before Mr. Reagan's historic first meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in November 1985 at the Geneva Summit. President Bill Clinton read her book, The Living and the Dead, The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia, in preparation for his Victory Day visit to Moscow in 1995. She is also the author of Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia. Her current book project explores the politics of the past in Putin's Russia. Here at Wellesley College, Professor Tumarkin teaches courses on the Soviet Union, medieval and imperial Russia, World War II as Memory and Myth, and the Russian Performing Arts, as well as a first-year seminar on Vladimir Putin. While I have not had the pleasure of taking a class with Professor Tumarkin, I have heard only wonderful things from my peers in the history department. As Russia and Putin continue to stand out as issues of vital importance, both in the United States and globally, I can think of no one more qualified to speak to these issues. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Tumarkin.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to address you at the Albright Institute, which until now I've admired only from afar. Yes, it's true that Bill Clinton did claim that he read my book, and he wrote to the head of the USIA who had sent it to him, "It's a great book," he underlined it, which I thought, oh, that's wonderful. And then he wrote, "I'm working my way through it." I thought, oh, well, so mixed. Vladimir Putin. Now, I have to say that much to my personal irritation, he has been temporarily, I say temporarily, eclipsed by Rocket Man Kim Jong-un, about whom you've heard a great deal just earlier this week. Nonetheless, he is very much in the news, usually as the big bad boy of the world, with hacking, meddling, and so much else. One of the things that's very striking about Vladimir Putin is that since 2013, so in 13, 14, 15, and 16, he has topped Forbes magazine's list of the world's most powerful people as #1 every single year. The 2017 list has not yet come out, but in 2016, he was #1, followed by the then president-elect Donald Trump, followed by Angela Merkel as 3rd, followed by Xi Jinping of China, and in 5th place, you want to guess? Pope Francis, who's a goodie, the one best goodie of the group, right? So how can that be? How can Russia's president be considered year after year the world's most powerful person in a country whose economy accounts for about 3% of global GDP, ranked just above Australia and Spain? The United States accounts for about 25% of the global GDP. It's true, of course, Russia is the world's largest country by far, the world's largest producer of oil, followed by Saudi Arabia in that, and the world's second largest producer of natural gas, following the United States only by a tiny, tiny bit. So how can the leader of a country with such a tiny economy be deemed the world's most powerful? That's one paradox. And so the question for us today is, who is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin? How are we to understand the source of his strength and also his extreme popularity? Let's take a look at his popularity in Russia. Never mind the United States, where in a mid-December 2016 poll, 37% of Republicans in the US approved of Vladimir Putin. In Russia, President Putin's popularity ratings and approval ratings are rarely fall below 80%. The latest poll, there's only one really reliable, non-official, non-governmentally controlled polling agency, the Levada polling agency. In December 2017, in that poll, 81% approval rating for the president, with only 18% of people saying they do not approve him. What is interesting is that the approval ratings for the rest of the government are vastly lower. For Prime Minister Medvedev, in December 2017, only 44% approval rating, with 55% not approving him. The approval of the government is at 52%. The approval of the parliament, the Duma, is abysmal at 42% approval, although it's way higher than US approval of the US Congress, which in 2017 was 19%. And the approval rating of Putin is even more striking in contrast to other poll figures, which show that the citizens of the Russian Federation think that their economic situation and standard of living are poor, and also they are concerned about the general direction in which Russia is going. This year, in November, just a couple of months ago, only 56% thought that Russia is going in the right direction. Almost 30% said it's in the wrong direction. People have consistently said, over 60% said that the standard of living has grown worse since the previous year, and yet Putin's approval rating is sky high. The distribution of wealth vis-a-vis equality, almost 50% say it's gotten worse. Russia has massive wealth inequality, and in November of 2016, the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report identified Russia as the world's most unequal country, with a staggering 74.5% of the nation's wealth controlled by the richest 1% of the people. And yet, Putin's rating is sky high. So how do we explain it? Well, to some extent, we can say that the economy has been improving of late after an enormous drop in 2009 and 2010, after sort of the global collapse of the economy in 2008. Russia's been coming out of a recession. The stock market has been performing well. As I said, Russia continues as the world's largest producer of oil. Typically, it has high rates of inflation, but in 2017, these were not bad. Unemployment is low, although there are terrible systemic endemic problems of very poor infrastructure, lack of innovation in industry and technology, a terrible brain drain, many other things. But back to the ratings. How do you explain how he stands alone? Some of it comes, and I say this as an historian, I think, from, I know I say this as an historian, some of it I think comes from what the Soviets used to call Russia's naive monarchism, or the naive monarchism of the Russian peasantry, when Soviet historians talked about Russia's imperial past, even late medieval past. A propensity on the part of the Russian peasantry to believe that the Tsar is good, and that everything that's going wrong with the country is the fault of the wicked government officials and landowners. It was this deep-seated notion that the Tsar is good and different from the rest that helped explain the development of the cult of Lenin, actually, in the 1920s, something that I know a great deal about because I wrote the book, as they say. But Putin has really worked on this image of himself as a loner. And that's very important, isolated from everybody else. You see this every year on New Year's Eve. This is probably not his favorite photograph. The biggest holiday in Russia is New Year's Eve. This comes from the Soviet period, which of course outlawed public religious celebrations, and so Christmas could not be celebrated, and everything was rolled into New Year's. New Year's tree, New Year's gifts, Grandfather Frost, who's their equivalent of Santa Claus. In a poll in 2017, 77% of Russians named New Year's Eve as the most important holiday. How do we celebrate New Year's Eve? Well, better not ask. I don't want to know how you celebrate New Year's Eve. I'm not going to tell the campus police. But when we watch something on television, we watch my hometown. I was born and raised New Yorker. You know, the stupid ball fall down, you know, sort of go down in Times Square with, you know, 1 million people with those funny glasses, you know, with the name of the year on them, sort of celebrating together, jumping, cheering all together. This is what Russians see on television. This actually was in the Soviet period as well. Every year, the Russian president goes on television on New Year's Eve with the background, as you see, of the Kremlin. He has a solemn, short presidential speech filled with platitudes about how the next year is going to bring out even more our joint love of our motherland and how we all love each other and our families are so wonderful. Patriarchal, paternalistic speech, utterly stiff. Then you have a close-up of the Kremlin clock at midnight. There are 12 solemn chimes, and the national anthem is played. And typically, people actually stand up in their living rooms. I was only once crazy enough to spend the winter in Russia, actually twice, but only once when I was there for New Year's Eve. And my friends didn't stand up, but everybody watches this. So the loner. We could also, to see this different image, we could do something, or what I do in my first year seminar on Putin, which I only introduced this past year. I'm about to teach the second iteration of it next month. We watched in the first class clips of 2 inaugurations. President Obama's, particularly 2009 inauguration, which, are you old enough to remember? I don't know, you always look so young to me. You know, people, crowds, smiles. When he's coming out, you know, sort of, they're coming out in groups. He's walking out with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Michelle and the kids, and everybody's grinning and everybody's cheering, and the crowd is outside and they're all dressed every which way. What you see this is President Putin's third inauguration, third term in 2012. First, the television coverage shows the empty streets of Moscow. It's because the center has been cleared, and you only see this one vehicle with a convoy of other vehicles driving up to sort of one of the entrances of the Kremlin. And the president-elect, he's not exactly president-elect since he's still president, but anyway, in 2012, he had been prime minister. So the president-elect steps out, there's an honor guard, he salutes and so on. And then you see him, he walks up the stairs, there's a corridor with red carpeting, and there are guards standing there so stiffly that there's a sway back. You know, they've got these bayonets, and they're sort of like this, you know, actually looking up with ridiculous uniforms. Well, there they are. They look like toy soldiers. These uniforms were actually designed by somebody I know, the deputy director of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, who had a specialty in heraldry. And so he was asked to design all the different army uniforms. So he walks completely alone, and you see him, there are not even any people there. So you just see him walking. And this magnificent hall, you can tell the doors are particularly nice. And then as he comes, finally, and he's turned a corner. You see there's a corner back there. He's turned that corner. He's been completely alone. Then he comes and he walks, and there are people standing there, men in suits, ladies in dresses, and people applaud. And you actually see him walking there. And then there are these symbols. The flag is brought in by goose-stepping soldiers. The Russians are really great at the goose step. It doesn't work so nicely in clogs. And they carry the Constitution. When he swears, our presidents swear in the Bible. They swear on the Constitution. So the loner aspect is part of his effective image of machismo, along with a kind of eroticized hypermasculinity that's very important. From the beginning, in his first electoral campaign in 2000 and moving forward in time, the Putin image focused on his strength and masculinity. If you would look at videos or images of photos of President Yeltsin, whom he replaced at the very end of his rule, he was bloated, overweight, sickly, slurring. Well, he was an alcoholic and very ill. And here you have the vigor of this trim man known for his martial arts skills and so on. Another aspect of Putin that has made him very popular, and in this very relevant to a certain friend of yours in the White House, is his vulgarity. He uses swear words and vulgar images a lot, and he has from the get-go. This doesn't come out in the press. He uses scatological references, not, other things that only in the White House they can say these things. And one really striking example that I think really shocked everybody was in 2002 in a conference with journalists from the European Union. A French male journalist asked President Putin about civilian deaths in Chechnya, with the war in Chechnya that was going on, the Second Chechen War, begun in 1999. And evidently he must have sounded somewhat sympathetic, certainly, to the civilian Chechen civilians. And Putin told the Frenchman that he might consider converting to Islam and getting himself circumcised. And then he said, "We have specialists in this area. I will recommend that they do the operation on you in such a way that nothing will grow back." I consider that a little on the vulgar side. I don't know about you. So the image of strength, vulgarity, the martial arts, judo, and a Russian sort of martial arts cum wrestling called sambo, felling a Siberian tiger image. It was a very famous song in 2002, sung by a girl band. I want a man like Putin who's full of strength. I want a man like Putin who doesn't drink. That's very important. I want a man like Putin who won't make me sad. After the election, the president received thousands of love letters. And in a poll taken in 2012, 20% of Russian women said that they wanted to marry him. 20%. But there's a varied image of activity. And so now I'd like to just show you I have a couple, I keep these on my refrigerator. These are my Putin calendars, 2018, 17. My husband has a picture of the Pope, so we have his guy, my guy. Here, 2018, just arrived. So here's a little video about.
Doesn't it? I can't believe a whole year has gone by since the Putin 2016 calendar came out. But here it is, the Putin 2017 calendar. 12 months, 12 portraits of the president. Putin with a candle. Putin with a child. with a kitten, Putin by himself, with war veterans, and so on and so on. 365 days of Vladimir Putin. This is August. Putin with a combine harvester, talking about the importance of bread. Oh, Putin with a delta plane and a crane. Very fluffy, very cute. Moving on to October, Putin with a horse. Putin dressed as a fighter pilot who says that the aim is to create the kind of army which will guarantee Russia's sovereignty, the respect of her partners, and a stable peace. This is December, and finally, the calendar looks ahead to 2018 with this portrait and these words of the president. Vladimir Putin says, "Russia is a peace-loving and a self-sufficient country. We don't need other people's territories," he says. "We don't need other people's natural resources. But if we are threatened, we are prepared to use weapons to guarantee our security." Happy New Year.
So, yeah, I'd like to say something about calendar 2017, calendar 2018. These cost only about 95 cents if you buy them on a kiosk in Moscow. It cost $14.62 on Amazon. So there's a very big difference between these two calendars, and I couldn't find any video or even images from this one, so from the new one. If you can see, on every page on the bottom, there is a pretty stylized natural scene, and there's a Russian nesting doll. I don't have to, everybody knows about these Russian nesting dolls, right? So each time, mimosas, with the kitty, and it's fuzzy, this is fuzzy and that's fuzzy. Nesting doll, and you get to spring. So that's what you have in the bottom. The 2018 calendar is much tougher. I mean, now that this is a very key moment to be talking about Putin, because 2 months from now, February, March, 2 months from now is the election. The election that he's for his fourth term as president is going to be on March 18th, which was chosen specifically because it's the 4th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So here he is, not looking quite as laid back. See, more laid back in 2017, less laid back in 2018. Then what's interesting, he says that, talks about the diversity of the country. Well, he means the diversity means all of these different cities and towns. And so here, so it says Putin with a candle. This is January, and January is the month in which there's Christmas. Russian Orthodox Christmas is January 7th. The old Russian calendar during the period of the Empire was 13 days behind the Western calendar, and Russia changed this in 1918, and just 100 years ago. But the Orthodox Church kept this old calendar. So he's lighting candles in a church, and it happens to be in the town of Novgorod, which is very important in the medieval period. And so in each case, he's in a different place, and you have the coat of arms of the city. So it's talking about, sort of Russia is mighty. And so here he is. He's again the sportsman. It's February, so he's the hockey player, and it's a very interesting quote. It says, at the beginning, meaning I guess when he was a child, I was even afraid to get on skates, and now it looks like it's worked out pretty well. False modesty here, right? So this is Sochi, where the Olympics were, and this is the coat of arms of Sochi. So in each case, mostly it's this is the building near where the Olympic Stadium was. In many cases, it's a church. This is Khabarovsk in Siberia. This is interesting. April, Crimea. And so there's a lot of talk about how Russian Crimea is. And so this is Sevastopol, the capital of Crimea, and it's a Russian battleship. The Black Sea Fleet is there, so it's very militaristic. The coat of arms of the city of Sevastopol. For May, World War II is still extremely important in Russian national mythology and political culture. It was the greatest event of the 20th century. It was the victory over the Germans. It was also the greatest losses. The Soviet Union lost over 27 million people in that war. And there is a public commemoration that only began a few years ago where people march down the main thoroughfare of Moscow, hundreds of thousands of them. I did this myself twice in 2015 and 2016. For hours and hours, bearing aloft photographs of their loved ones who had died in the war. And this is Putin with a photograph of his father, who had not died in the war. I mean, he had fought in the war and been wounded. This is all in Volgograd. So I don't have to show you every month, but it's gone now to all of the various places of the Soviet Union. This is Kazan. Actually, that's a very interesting, I just really like this one. So this is our idea of diversity. There he is with a Tatar hat on. Kazan is a city on the Volga. I've been there a couple of times. It's divided, I think, just literally 50-50. 50% Russian, 50% Tatar. It's a wonderful place, and actually, in the most recent poll, it comes out as the third most desirable city to live in Russia. And so this photograph shows the major cathedral of Kazan and the major mosque, which are cheek by jowl. It's supposed to, I think it's the largest mosque in the world, if not almost the largest mosque. So you have a different mode now, which expresses something very important about Putin, and that is his strong sense of territoriality. The pride in the size of Russia. What's important to him is not just geopolitics, but actually literally geography. He's an amateur geographer. He's very well trained. He revived, actually he didn't have to revive, there was still, from the imperial period, a National Geographic Society that's met in St. Petersburg since the time of the emperors, the Tsars, and he heads it. And they meet twice a year, and he actually chairs the meetings. So Russia's land and its variety and its strength and its power. I mean, really a big contrast from the flowers and the little nesting dolls, you know. So that's another aspect of Putin, and Putin is not necessarily Putin himself, his handlers, very, very important, and I think fascinating. So, but of course there are other different kinds of images. This is what we call Putin topless. This was taken in the beginning of August of 2017. He went on a fishing trip with the Minister of Defense, and this photograph, he was fishing for pike, and he actually had this pike fishing outfit, or whatever, snorkel thing, whatever, when he was chasing a pike underwater and so on. And this is a clearly sexualized image. I mean, there's no doubt about it. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you guys remember, I didn't know how to, anyway, there was a Russia Now, a Russian Area Studies faculty panel that we have every year, and that was the image that I used for the poster, and people apparently around the president's office were complaining that they were fed up with looking at Putin's chest. And this is a little phallic as well. These two photos, along with many others, were posted on the Kremlin website. I mean, it's not that the paparazzi were there. So there's a pride in this. But this is nothing new. I mean, the first topless photos of Putin were 10 years ago, in 2007, when he went fishing in the same area, Tuva in southern Siberia, with Prince Albert of Monaco. And then, of course, this is the most famous photo of Putin. When he was chasing when he was chasing the pike, they were all, I mean, it really hit the media. It was in the US media in the West, but also in Russia. It went viral, these photographs and the stories. And there's a Russian fairy tale about a poor fisherman who catches a magic pike that grants him wishes. So there were all these sort of tweets or something about what the wishes were. And one of them said that Vladimir Putin chased the pike for the benefit of the homeland and asked it to lift Western sanctions and recognize Crimea as Russian. So then, of course, as I said, this is actually the most widely viewed photograph of Putin in the West. I like this version better. And then I also like this version because he's in camouflage and he's on a bear, and of course the image of the Russian bear is the sort of the image. But interestingly, we've been seeing newer images of Putin now as avuncular or even grandfatherly. So, and Lenin and Stalin were often pictured with children, and now you see him also, Putin, pictured with children or teenagers. So there's Lenin. By the way, Lenin hated children. He liked cats, but his sister said that he wanted nothing to do with two-legged snivelers, is what he called children. Apropos Lenin, there was an interview, television interview with Oliver Stone in 2017 in June. Some of you might have heard about it, an interview of Putin. That's where he first mentioned, Putin, that he had grandchildren. I mean, they're so private about, he's been so private about his personal life. And he reiterated later during an annual TV call-in show. But when he talked with Oliver Stone said that what's his name? Leonardo DiCaprio could play Putin. But then he said, you know, he could also play Lenin. So here he is with young people, Putin is with young people at a summer camp in Sochi for gifted children. And then at a call-in show, a little boy was asking him a question. So then he thought, well, he could also play Lenin. There's the young Lenin on the right and Leonardo DiCaprio. You know, I just wanted to show that to you. Don't you think DiCaprio could play Lenin? Oh, but that's a whole other story. So why now is he revealing about being a grandfather? Well, because he just turned 65, and in October, and in Russia, that is old. It's past retirement age. I think retirement age is mostly around 60. The average life expectancy in Russia is higher than it's ever been, at just over 71. In the 90s, it was down as low as 65. But for men, the average life expectancy is 66.5 years, which is really very low. No matter how much Botox, I mean, you don't think that chest is there just by itself, do you? Right? And facelifting and whatever he's doing, and no matter how much he works out, which he does, he's very fit, it will soon look ridiculous to have the strong man image once he's in the second half of his 60s. And he needs, anyway, to relate to younger people, the next generation, because after all, it was very, very telling. There were protests in Moscow and especially in St. Petersburg against corruption. And a lot of the people who were protesting were younger than you are. A lot of people of sort of late high school age and then college age kids. So he has to find some way to appeal to younger people. Back to Putin himself. Who is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin? I want to give you a little bit of biography. He was born in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, of course, in 1952. He comes from an ordinary working class family. His father, as I mentioned, was wounded in the war. He had an older brother who died, who didn't survive infancy, and then another older brother died during the siege of Leningrad, in which about 1 million people died during World War II. So he was brought up effectively as an only child. He studied, not effectively, totally as an only child, because he was born in 52, 7 years after the end of the war. He studied law. Now, in high school, he talked about wanting to join the KGB. He had a very romantic view of the KGB, as many people did, sort of swashbuckling, exciting, taking risks for the motherland. He really had watched all kinds of spy movies that had intrigued him. And he actually went to a KGB office when he was in high school and said, "How do I get here?" And they said, "Well, you don't wait, we call you." But they did say that the Faculty of Law would be good preparation. And so that's what he did. And in 1975, after graduating from Leningrad State University in the Faculty of Law, he joined the KGB, likely to fulfill these dreams, but really sort of a romantic idealism, but also for upward social mobility. It's a very respected profession. It was a very respected profession. He studied at the KGB so-called Red Banner Institute, and in 1985 was sent to Dresden in East Germany to work both with the Stasi, the dreaded East German secret police, and to spy on the Stasi. Typical, right? And he was there from 1985 to 1990. He was never particularly imbued with communist ideology. Almost no one was in the later Brezhnev era and the cynical 80s, 70s, and 80s. But I think what's most important is to consider what he missed by being in Dresden from 1985 to 1990. He missed Gorbachev. I mean, he missed perestroika. He missed all of this sort of demokratizacja, which was not democratization, but it was making the Communist Party much more effective at the grassroots level. Perestroika, the restructuring, glasnost, the voicing of free speech and open criticism, the facing down of the Stalinist past, a spirit of public freewheeling debate, the commemoration of the millennium of Christianity in 1988. Russia had been baptized. The Grand Prince of Kiev had taken Orthodox Christianity, baptized in 988, and then the subsequent introduction of the freedom of religion. He missed all that. And he was mired in this provincial, gray East European city, East German city rather, where the living standards were higher than in the USSR. The apartment was better. The quality and the amount of goods, quantity of goods in the stores was better. But still, it was grim. And he was shocked by the fall of the wall in 1989. And in fact, he himself guarded the Soviet KGB headquarters. There was a crowd that had gone over to Stasi and was pilfering and was vandalizing it. And he actually was quite brave. He stood outside and said, "There are Soviet soldiers here at the windows, armed, and ordered to shoot anybody who takes a step inside this building." And the crowd went away. So, and then they were meanwhile, sort of shoving all this stuff into the furnace, trying to burn everything that they could. So he retreated to Leningrad in 1990, which itself was also grim by then, with food shortages and things going very much awry at the period, this late Gorbachev period. And there was a great deal of disillusionment with Gorbachev at this time. And he got involved, well, first he got a job. His old law professor had become the mayor of Leningrad. So he got this low-level job at Leningrad State University spying on foreign students, like you guys, right? So he was spying on foreign students. But then he moved into Leningrad politics and quickly moved ahead. He quit the KGB in 1991 after there had been a foiled attempted coup by the head of the KGB and other hardliners, people who President Bush the Elder called the coup people. I remember that. And he moved into the higher ranks of politics in Moscow. In the late 90s, he became the chief of the presidential staff, the chief of staff for the president, for Yeltsin, and then the head in 1998 of the FSB, which was the Russian successor to the KGB, until August 1999, named deputy prime minister, then prime minister, named by Yeltsin and chosen to succeed him when Yeltsin resigned at the very end on New Year's Eve, 1991. So that's how he landed where he was. There are lots of other issues. So very quickly, he was elected. Then he had to stand for election on his own. In 2000, he served a 4-year term till 2004, re-elected till 2008, then became prime minister, where Medvedev became minister, where Medvedev became president, Dmitry Medvedev. And then, and during that time, spearheaded a move in the Constitution that the presidential term should be moved from 4 years to 6 years. And so when he was elected for a third term, I mean, the Constitution said you could only have 2 consecutive terms. Elected for the third term for 6 years till 2018. And then, as you know, there's going to be an election, as I just mentioned. If he wins, which he will, he's going to, and remains in power that whole time. He will be president, he will have been president or prime minister, meaning the most powerful man in Russia, for 24 years consecutively. Just the same as Stalin, 1929 to 1953, also 24 years. So in the first 2 terms, the work was to improve the economy and also to bring back something like more akin to what you had in the Soviet period, a power vertical, where the authority of the president and of the Kremlin was greater and greater. He worked on doing this. There are 89 regions in Russia. All of them had elected governors. He changed the rules so that the Kremlin appoints the governors, or they basically appoint the people who stand for election with no opponent or with no reasonable opponent. So they're controlling the regions, controlling the media, increasing authoritarianism, brought back the old Soviet national anthem. Poor Yeltsin had tried God Save the Tsar, but it didn't go over very well. That was the imperial hymn. Now the Soviet national anthem, obviously with new words. And people really needed this. A lot of Americans don't realize just how bad the 1990s were in Russia. They thought, oh, it's wonderful, communism is ended, they have democracy, they have elections, what more do they want? They wanted a lot more. The economy had really fallen apart. Many people who had been managing state-owned enterprises basically just stole them. It's what they called the piratization, not the privatization of Russia. You had power in the hands of about 9 oligarchs, and the superpower had become a beggar nation, of national humiliation, watching its former rival, the U.S., acting as a hegemon in a unipolar world. 1998, the utter collapse of the ruble. And now you have this steady improvement in the economy, helped by the rise of oil prices. I mean, one of the things that did Gorbachev in, probably more than anything else, was that there was a steep decline in the price of oil beginning in 1986. And he had just come to power in 1985. And the economy is utterly dependent on oil. And now they were steadily rising oil prices. The economy was growing 5 to 7% per year. At the same time, there was a kind of siege mentality in the Kremlin, the so-called color revolutions, protests from below. In Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. I'm not talking about what happened 10 years later in 2014. This was popular revolution to bring in somebody called Viktor Yushchenko, who later was replaced by a Kremlin-backed president, who then was ousted in 2014. The Arab Spring was like the last straw. In 2010, all these popular protests from below, that's Putin's nightmare. And then protests started in Russia in 2011, in the fall of 2011. And so on September 27th, Putin and Medvedev went on television and announced that they had long been planning for the 2012 election to just switch roles, and that now Putin was going to become president or run for president, and he was going to name Medvedev his prime minister. That it was a deal. And people were horrified. I mean, all my friends were horrified. That this was, undermining the popular democratic process. There were a lot of people who wanted to re-elect Medvedev, who had been different and more liberal. And I'll say something about this. But the protests in 2011 after this were against irregularities and corruption in the parliamentary elections. Which were terribly corrupt. I mean, monitors would go in at 8 o'clock when the polls office opened to find that the ballot boxes were already full, like that. And thousands, tens of thousands of people came out on the streets in Moscow and in Petersburg particularly. And then there were more protests in 2012 in advance of the March presidential election. And Putin did believe and does believe, to this day, I'm sure, that Hillary Clinton was behind it all. That it was the U.S. that did it, and that it was the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was behind these protests. I just went last month to a lecture at Harvard's Davis Center by David Kramer, who had been under Bush Assistant Secretary of State for Russian and Eurasian Affairs, and he said, and I quote from his talk, "The State Department couldn't organize a parade in Washington on C Street, much less a mass protest in Russia." But Putin did and does believe that the U.S. aims to undermine Russia at every opportunity. And so there are these defensive moves to weaken Europe, to meddle in European elections, to meddle in U.S. elections, in order to disorganize and weaken our democratic process, more than the desire to see Trump elected, I think, as the main impetus. But I think all of us experts, Russia experts, most of us, got it wrong. I remember Lilia Shevtsova and Angela Stent, who spoke here in 2016. This was just the month before the election, our presidential election. And they both agreed, and I agreed with them, that actually Kremlin and the Kremlin and Putin would hope for Hillary to win because she's predictable. Putin is the one who always wants to be unpredictable. Suddenly he's seizing Crimea by stealth. Suddenly there's the Malaysian. Then he's zooming, these planes, on the borders of NATO countries and so on. So. But I think we all underestimated his personal hatred of Hillary Clinton, and his belief that she really was sort of enemy number one. So he was elected, of course, and his third term has been very different from the first two. He decided to not unify the country, which is what, with the power vertical, there was a kind of a authoritarianism, but also unifying the country. He decided to divide it, actually, to take sides with the ultra-nationalist, xenophobic, and anti-Western portions of the population, with a special emphasis on ideology and symbolic politics. Patriotism, national pride, you see a sharply increased anti-Western, anti-American rhetoric, the harsh sentencing of the Pussy Riot punk group in 2012. In July 2013, the infamous anti-homosexual propaganda law, which was later confirmed by Putin in 2014. Hard cultural politics. In May 2014, there was a law criminalizing making public statements that devalue Soviet actions in World War II. Then you have the 2014 annexation, stealth invasion of Crimea, annexation, the war in eastern Ukraine, the sanctions, the Middle East policy, Syria, and so on. I still have some time, yeah? Yeah, okay. So, in a sense, I now want to backtrack and say, I chose the title for this talk and the subject some months ago, and I want to modify it for an important reason. And that is that the U.S. policy establishment and the media has long focused far too much on the individual personalities and individual leaders who were governing the Soviet Union and Russia. Ronald Reagan connected with Mikhail Gorbachev at the first summit. Bill Clinton had these bear hugs with Boris Yeltsin relating man to man. You were too young to remember, but famously in 2001, when George Bush first met Vladimir Putin, he looked into his eyes and saw his soul. He came out with this sentence, George W. Bush did, that he regretted a lot later. Listen to this. I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. President Putin and President Obama clearly disliked each other. And then you have this really kind of vile, virulent statements against Putin shortly after the election, our election in 2016. John McCain said that Putin, that the U.S. presidential transition is underway. Putin wants to improve relations. We should place as much faith, said John McCain, in such statements as any other made by a former KGB agent who has plunged his country into tyranny, murdered his political opponents, and invaded his neighbors, threatened America's allies, attempted to undermine America's elections. Now, I believe it does not serve our interests, nor is it proper to personalize the U.S.-Russian relationships in this way. Ronald Reagan, I don't have to tell you, was a decided anti-communist. And he branded the Soviet Union as the, quote, focus of evil in the modern world. People shortened that to the evil empire. But he never, ever said anything against any individual Soviet leader. And is it so helpful anyway to focus on Putin? Trying to figure out one man really the best way to understand Russian politics? I mean, somehow when you look at the news or read the newspapers, there's a sense on the part of so many people that everything bad that happens in Russia was personally ordered by Putin. How can one man, it's impossible. I mean, the only instance I can think of where one national leader controlled and determined almost everything important that happened coming out of the central government was Frederick the Great of Prussia in the 1740s. But that was a very different situation, a very small country and so on. The fact is that the Kremlin is a very complex institution, or really collection of institutions. So I want to say something about the Kremlin itself. Of course, the Kremlin is far from monolithic, and it advances a diverse ideological repertoire. U.S. policymakers don't seem to understand that there is a tremendous amount of doctrinal diversity that goes on in the Kremlin. It's a difficult balancing act in some respects. And it consists of at least what I would call three main ecosystems. There's the presidential administration, which is an institution within the Kremlin that shapes its ideology, not in terms of doctrine, but rather works on molding public opinion, producing a kind of presidential product, mostly seen on TV, and 80% of the Russian public get their news from TV and not from the internet. There's a military-industrial complex, which is unlike the presidential administration, which uses marketing technology to sell Russia as a kind of brand. The military-industrial complex is another ecosystem with its own structure, institution, funds. It has a kind of ideological inertia that falls back on a traditional trope that all Russia needs is sound military patriotic upbringing or education for upcoming generations. And then there's the so-called white or ultra-nationalists ecosystem funded by the military-industrial complex with a very much further reach. It's the branch that pushes the ultra-conservative agenda of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church, this is really important. You cannot call Russia a strictly theocratic state. This is not the Byzantine Empire. But the Russian Orthodox Church is a strong supporter, and Putin spends a lot of energy making sure that people see him at prayer and see him with the patriarch Kirill. So here he is with the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, pretty chummy. And here he is with Kirill also kissing an icon of the Mother of God. This is extremely important. And the church is used to cooperate with the Kremlin in an attempt to rob the West of the kind of high moral ground in the culture war of values. Family values, sexual orientation, gender issues. I'm winding up here. The title, I think, of my talk was Who is Vladimir Putin, Mr. Putin, and what in the world is he after? So the last couple of minutes, just something about the foreign connection here. The white ecosystem is the ecosystem that's supported with large amounts of money. The far-right parties in Europe, such as that of Marine Le Pen in France. And there's a genuine ideological connection between the far-right in Europe and the Kremlin, a kind of post-totalitarian authoritarianism, an exclusivist nationalism, a defiance of the European Union. 68% of Russians right now say that the US is their main enemy. 29% say Ukraine is. In fact, you could say that Russia is itself a European state captured by the far right. Meddling in the US elections, I said, to weaken, to disrupt, to split. Also, this attempt in Europe, the Brexit vote was considered a gift to the Kremlin. The Syrian war, one of the several reasons that Russia got so involved in Syria, I guess I'd see three. One is most important, to make sure that Russia is viewed as a major player in the most important, the volatile area of the world. Another was to distract attention from Ukraine, which it was very effective at. And the third is to produce more and more Syrian refugees, which are so weakening Europe and creating such problems. What we're going to see here in terms of Russian-US relations is not clear. President Trump said he wanted to, wouldn't it be nice if we get along with Russia? Wouldn't it be nice? Remember he said, wouldn't it be nice, right? The fact is, he's not the only one. The USSR came to an end over a quarter of a century ago, and in the course of this quarter century, there have been 4 attempted resets with each past president. Each one trying to establish new and productive relations with post-Soviet Russia, and none of them have worked. Because Russia and the US have very different views of what a productive relationship would look like. What does Russia want in the way of Russian-US relations? They want the United States to recognize Russia's sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, if not in Central and Eastern Europe even. They want the U.S. to recognize Russia's right to a seat at the table of the most important global powers, and to have a say in all international decisions. That's perhaps the bottom line. Putin wants the U.S. to treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union, whose neighbors are not quite Soviet powers. This is, I think, a sign of weakness, because if he were really interested in Russia's national interest, he would want prosperous neighbors on his border, not weak ones. And most important, he wants he wants a kind of new Yalta system where the United States, Russia, and China divide up the world into spheres of influence, and also that nobody interferes with Russia's domestic affairs. What they hated about the Democrats was that they were always chiding and involving the pesky human rights issue, which is what the Republicans have not done. So for the United States, a productive relationship has meant usually that Russia should adhere to the global rules and norms that we and our allies follow. It's hard to see how these very different views can come together constructively. So the future in that regard is probably pretty grim, but it's always appropriate to end a lecture on Russia on a minor key, because it's a wonderful place, but the symphony is written in a minor key. Thank you very much.